Welcome back to The Bark-Covered House by William Knowlin. We are now in chapter 23, and this chapter is entitled Grandfather's Powderhorn and War with Pirates. It's a pretty exciting chapter. Here we go. Time sped on. The earth had traveled its circuit many times since Father sold his little place in Putnam County, state of New York, and had bade adieu to all the dear scenes of his childhood and youth, and came to battle for himself and family in the woods of Michigan. He did this part bravely. He was a strong man, mentally and physically strong, and possessed just enough of the love of a romantic and strange light to help him battle successfully with the incidents and privations common to such as settle in a new country with but little capital. He worked his way through. He had a very retentive memory and possessed the faculty of pleasing his visitors to no common extent. Father, at the close of the Tripoli War, 1805, was about the age I was when we started for Michigan. He often told me of the war with Tripoli and trouble with Algiers. He gloried in the name of an American and often related the prowess and bravery of our soldiers in defending their flag and the rights of American citizens at home and abroad, on the land and on the sea. Of course, when the 4th of July came around, I went to celebrate that day. As cannon were almost always fired at Dearbornville at that day, I would go out there to listen to the big guns and their tremendous roar as they were fired every minute for a national salute. The sound of their booming died away beyond Detroit River in Canada, and let the Canadians and all the others in this part of the universe know that we were holding the 4th of July in Dearbornville. When I went home at night, I told Father about it and what a good time I had had, and that they fired one big gun in honor of Michigan. On such days, his patriotic feelings were wrought up, and he talked much of wars, patriotism, and so forth. On such an occasion, he told me that his father, William Knowlin, was a captain of militia in the state of New York when he was a boy, that I was named for him, and that when he was done with it, that I should have my grandfather's ancient powderhorn. It was red and carved out very nicely, covered with beautiful scrolls and old-fashioned letters. The first two letters of my grandfather's name, W.N., were on it, and towards the smaller end of the horn, my father's given name, John. These were inscribed on it long since the horn was made. It was made when Washington was about 25 years old and no doubt saw service in the French and Indian War, in the defense of the English colonies of America. Its history, some of it, is shrouded in mystery. It has passed down through the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 through 4 generations of men, and was given to me by my father as an heirloom, a relic of the past. Next to my father's name is the inscription E.B., and then follows these old lines. I, powder, with my brother Ball, a hero like, do conquer all. 'Tis best abroad with foreign foes to fight, and not at all at home to feel their hateful spite, where all our friends of every sex and age will be exposed unto their cruel rage. This was written by Lieutenant Abel Prindles, made at number 4, June 30th, 1757. He's probably thinking of, or it's written here at Fort at number 4. A famous location. The letters are old-fashioned. The S on it is made as an F is now. I presume it was a present from Lieutenant Prindle to grandfather. This horn is 16 inches long, measures 9 1/2 inches around at the butt, and would hold fully 4 pounds of powder. Father said in the war with Tripoli, 1803, one of the Barbary states, Captain Bainbridge sailed in the Philadelphia to Tripoli and chased one of the pirate boats into the harbor. He ventured a little too far and ran aground. The officers were made prisoner and the crew slaves to the Turks, and joined their countrymen who had preceded them. But Father said that the Americans were too brave a people to be subjected to slavery. Other Americans rescued them, and it was proved that the United States would protect their flag throughout all the world. He often told me of Commodore Decatur and William Eaton. They were among his ideal American heroes. He said that Decatur conceived the idea of retaking the Philadelphia and destroying her. He sailed into the harbor of Tripoli at night and up to the Philadelphia, made his vessel, the Intrepid, fast to her side and sprang on board. There he had often walked before under very different circumstances, in the light of other days when thousands of miles away and among his friends. Now how changed the scene. The Philadelphia was in an enemy's hands and her guns loaded to turn on her former owners at a moment's notice. Decatur was followed by 70 or 80 men, as brave Americans as ever walked on deck. The surprise was complete. The astonished Turks now saw the decks swarming with Americans armed and with drawn swords in their hands, and some of the Tripolians lost their heads, and some of them cried for quarters, and others tried to climb in the shrouds and the rigging of the ship, and some jumped overboard. In 10 minutes' time, Decatur and his crew were masters of the frigate. Now what grieved him most was that the noble ship, which they had rescued from the barbarous Arabs, had to be burnt, it being impossible to remove her from the sandbar where she lay. And so they brought on board the Philadelphia combustible materials which they had with them on the Intrepid and set her on fire. And in a short time the flames were leaping and dancing along the sides of the doomed ship. The devouring fire, greedily burning, crackling, hissing, destroying the timbers, leapt up the spars, caught hold of the rigging, and lighted up the whole place. It could have been, and was, seen for miles. The spectacle was awfully grand as well as sublime. Tripoli was lighted up. Hundreds of people could be seen in the streets by the light of the burning ship. The land forts and corsairs were all in plain sight of the American fleet. The light enabled the crew to see the bold Intrepid with her valiant crew leaving the burning ship and sailing away toward the American blockading fleet. The forts and some of the galleys opened fire upon them. It was one continuous roar of cannon belching forth fire and missiles of death. The balls and shot went singing over their heads and around, some striking the water and rising a cloud of spray which flew in all directions. But the victorious crew paid no attention and quietly sailed away to join their country's defender. They were soon beyond the reach of the foe and out of danger, and then they had a time to consider what they had accomplished. They had entered the enemy's stronghold, recaptured and burnt the Philadelphia, and put her Arab crew to the sword or driven them into the sea. All this they did without the loss of a single man. Father said the inhabitants of Tripoli were Turks who exacted taxes and received tribute from all Christian nations, and that they had taken some of the American seamen and held them as slaves. The Bashaw declared war with America, a country which he knew very little. He put his American slaves in chain gangs, and in this way they were obliged to labor for that government. There was no chance for them to escape, and they must remain in slavery unless rescued by their countrymen. Father said that the Turks of Tripoli were a band of pirates in disguise, robbers upon the high seas. The war occurred during the administration of President Jefferson. Congress sent Commodore Preble with a squadron of 7 sail and 1,000 men armed with heavy cannon. They appeared before Tripoli. The reigning Bashaw refused to treat for peace or to give up his slaves without his receiving a large ransom. Then it was that the thunder of the American cannon broke upon Tripoli and the bombardment of that city commenced. They were answered by hundreds of the enemy's guns. The earth trembled, the sea shook, the wild waves danced, the whitecaps broke as the cannonballs glanced on, plowing their way and plunging into the water. The strong buildings of Tripoli trembled to their very foundations, and hundreds of Arabs who were out upon their roofs when the battle commenced to witness it, in 5 minutes' time were skedaddling for their lives. The Bashaw's castle and the entire city felt severely the heavy blows of the American cannon. The enemy's fleet took refuge under the forts and away from the ships of North America. The Constitution sunk one of their boats, ran to aground, and the rest got under the shelter the best they could. One of the last wonders of the wrath of the Americans was poured out upon Tripoli in the shape of a fire ship. It contained 100 barrels of powder stored away below deck in a room prepared expressly for its reception. On the deck, over the powder, was placed hundreds of shells and pieces of iron, which the powder, when it exploded, would hurl as messengers of destruction among the enemy. The Intrepid was the ship selected for the daring deed. She was Decatur's favorite, and with her he captured the Philadelphia. There were 12 American braves who volunteered to take the fire ship into the enemy's squadron near the fort to fire it with a slow match. Then they were to try and escape back to their countrymen in a small boat. When it was night, they hoisted their sails and the ship quietly started through the darkness. But before they had gone as far as they wished to get among the enemy boats, they were discovered from the fort and an alarm raised. The great Decatur with his comrades stood gazing at the craft as it receded from them and the sails disappeared in the distance and the darkness of the night. What must have been their feelings as the noble ship disappeared? They were no doubt thinking of their comrades, so brave, who might be going into the jaws of death. Could it be possible that they would never return, that they would never meet anymore? They looked and listened, but they were gone. No sound of them could be heard. Awful suspense. All at once, the fort opened fire on the brave crew. The light of their batteries lighted up the shore, and the thunder of their cannon shook sea and earth. But where were the 12 Americans? Brave fellows, where were they? They had no doubt failed to get as far as they wished to before they were discovered. They risked their lives a little too long. They applied the fire to the trail of powder, and the ship blew up. Tripoli had never been shaken before, nor had she ever witnessed such a sight. The flames shot up toward the sky. The whole city was illuminated. The report and awful force caused by the blowing up of the ship made the enemy's vessels in the harbor heave to and fro and rock as though in a storm. Men's hearts failed them. They did not but that they were going to sink. The city itself was shaken to its foundations, from center to circumference. Men stood trembling and gazing with horror and astonishment. Not another cannon was fired, and the noise they made was no more than, when compared with the noise of the explosion, than the sound of a pop gun compared to the sound of a cannon. In fact, it was no comparison at all. Thousands stood ghastly and pale, not knowing what the next moment might reveal. The proud Bashaw had been badly shook up and disturbed in his dreams of conquering the Americans. He had heard of the advance of William Eaton, and he had made up his mind that it was dangerous for him to carry on war with beings who fought more like devils than men, so he concluded that he would go in for peace. 12 brave men who went with the fire ship were never heard of again. They returned to their comrades to tell the thrilling story of their last adventure. Never, no, never. They had sold their lives for their country dearly. They were never to see their homes in North America or their loved ones again. They had met their fate bravely and sacrificed their own lives for their country's glory. Father also related the adventures and hardships that were encountered and overcome by William Eaton, who formed a union with Hamet, the elder brother and rightful heir to reign at Tripoli. Hamet had been driven from his country and family, wife and children, and was in hopes, by the aid of Eaton and the American War, of being reinstated at Tripoli. He joined with General Eaton, who had received his commission from the American government, and assumed the title of general. In conjunction with Hammett, he raised an army of 1,200 men, adventurers of all nations who volunteered to fight under the American flag. They started from Alexandria in Egypt and marched 1,000 miles across the desert of Barca. They bore in their advance to the American flag, something that had never been seen in that country before. After a tedious march, they arrived at Derny, a city on the Mediterranean belonging to Tripoli. General Eaton summoned the city to surrender, and the governor sent him his reply, "My head or yours." Then the American general drew up his men and rapidly advanced to attack the fort which defended the city. He met with a strong resistance, the enemy numbering about 3,000. A terrible fire of musketry enveloped the combatants in fire and smoke. The voice of General Eaton, though he was wounded, was heard amid the din of battle, encouraging his men. After a severe contest of about 2 hours, they charged and carried by storm the principal fort. And they tore down the Tripolitan flag and ran up the stripes and stars in its place. This was the first time it had ever been raised over a fort on the Mediterranean Sea, or in that fact, the Old World. General Eaton was fortifying and making the place stronger, receiving some volunteers through the influence of Hammett, and preparing to march upon Tripoli to help the American fleet. But he was in need of supplies and every day was expecting to receive them. As the city and harbor were under his control, he had everything in readiness for his march, excepting the supplies, when the American frigate, the Constitution, appeared and announced that peace was declared 1805. The conditions were that Hammett should leave the country, his wife and children should be sent to him, the American prisoners were to be exchanged, and the American seamen not to be compelled to pay tribute anymore. The Americans who had been enslaved by the government of Tripoli were to be paid for their labor they had performed. It is evident that the reigning Bashaw was alarmed for his own safety and was glad to compromise. Father said it always grieved him to think that the Americans who had been held as slaves at Tripoli never returned to their native home. They were paid for their service during the time they had been enslaved, went on board a ship and sailed for North America, and were never heard of again. They slept the sleep of death with the 12 most brave beneath the dark cold waves, never more to see their families or friends. Father often repeated such stories in our wilderness home in regards to this war, the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. I and the other children always listened to these tales with much attention and interest. It was the way I received most of my knowledge in regards to such things in those days. As we lived in the woods of Michigan, my means of acquiring book knowledge were very limited. Now, I believe if I were to read the sum and substance of the same thing every month for a year, for years, the way he related those old stories would still be the accepted way to my mind, although they might be clothed in a language more precise and far more eloquent. It would not appear so to me. Very interesting that we get to hear about the family heirloom that's given down, down through the generations of family, and then him relating the story that he had heard in his youth from his father, and we get that whole sense of oral history that comes down through a book like this. I think it's very interesting that he talks about not having access to very many books as a child because of where they lived and the kind of access they had to bookstores, and that there weren't any. And yet, later on in life, he really takes a lot of time to write this book, and he writes it very eloquently. He's is a great amateur writer for the time period. I'm amazed by some of his writing. So it's a lot of fun, and to get to hear how he relates this story from his father hearing the story. So his father wasn't there and saw these events. They happened when he was still young, but he gets these sort of third hand, and yet the story is still rich and full of meaning for William Knowlin. So really, really great chapter. Thanks for being here on Townsends Plus, being a great support for what we do, whether it's the things we do here on Townsends Plus or how it relates to everything else we do on YouTube and so many other places. So thank you for that support, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching.